2020. This is the last episode for this week, and I am excited to have another wonderful guest today. But before I introduce our guest, let me just introduce my co-host, Carlos Ponce, who's from Mexico City, just outside of Mexico City. Hi, Carlos. Welcome back.
Thank you, Tulio.
And Kim Lantis, who is joining us from Hermosillo, Mexico. Hi, Kim.
Hello.
And we have Mark Collins with us today, who's from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, broadcasting from Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. We're going to be talking about the role AI can play in finding therapies and even possibly a cure to the big C word, cancer. But before we go into that topic, let's get to know you a little bit, Mark. If you don't mind, please introduce yourself. Let the audience know who Mark Collins is. Give us a little background about yourself. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Julio, and thanks again for the opportunity to talk to you all this afternoon. So my name is Mark Collins. As you can probably tell, I don't have a native Pittsburgh accent. I was originally born in the UK. I've worked around the globe, and I've been here in Pittsburgh, actually, Pennsylvania, for about 20 years. I think I've always been curious about how stuff worked. And so, I guess I was a shoo-in to go into science. I initially trained in microbiology. I was always interested in computers and programming. And then I did my Ph.D. looking for new antibiotics, actually, from bacteria that lived in tree roots, of all things. I worked in various startups and big pharma. And I really thought there had to be a better way to do drug discovery than the way we were doing it at the time, which was basically shaking trees, hoping to goodness that we find something that would be, active against, a disease. So I left big pharma to actually pursue that passion, as it were, and founded my own startup that looked at how we could apply AI. And this is, bearing in mind, this is like 1999, when AI really wasn't as prevalent as it is now. We're trying to use AI, in fact, to screen inside a computer, test inside a computer, lots of potential drugs. That startup got acquired by a US company here in Pittsburgh, and I came to Pittsburgh in 2001. And the last 20 years of my career, like I said, I've been trying to realize that vision of how we can use AI, data, and biology to really be able to discover new drugs.
Well, thanks for the introduction, Mark. Really appreciate it. So tell us a little bit about Helomics. What gave birth to this idea, and what role are you playing there? What's the charter and the goal for this company?
Yeah, so Helomics actually has been around for about 20 years here in Pittsburgh. And the founder of the company, a guy called Dr. Paul Kornbluth, who was a neurosurgeon, developed an approach to growing tumors. So taking a piece of tumor from the patient's body and growing it in the lab and testing drugs on it. And he had some amazing successes with glioblastoma, which is, is pretty awful brain cancer. And he turned that into a company, and that company grew. It got into some hard times. And about 2016, 2017, I came on board together with some other folks to try and turn it around and turn it from a sort of clinical testing company into more of a drug discovery, company, leveraging the assets that company essentially had gathered over these 20 years of testing tumors on drugs. So that's kind of where we are today. We merged last year with Predictive Oncology, which is we're a subsidiary of that company, and we're busy now building new approaches to try and solve my to realize my vision, but more importantly to to try and make an impact on the discovery of therapies for cancer.
Excellent. So let's go right into the topic today. Kim, please, what are we talking about today? Let's introduce the show.
Sure, thank you. So we've already done this a little bit, but the topic of today is, can we cure cancer with artificial intelligence? how AI, big data, and biology might help us, and I think already are helping us to discover and develop cancer therapies faster, smarter, and cheaper, which is all good news. So I guess my first question for you today, Mark, is why cancer specifically?
I think everybody has a personal connection to cancer, right? Everybody knows someone with cancer who has either survived or, unfortunately has not survived. And I think my passion has always been, I wanted to be a medical student, but I didn't get the grades to get into medical school because I spent too much time playing music and not studying. So I think I've always wanted to help people, and by going into the pharmaceutical industry, going into machine learning and AI, I think that's kind of my reason. So I think it's partly passion to do that, but it's also the fact that at Helomics we have tested a lot of tumors on drugs, so we have a lot of data that we feel needs to be, that can be really valuable to drive, different impacts in cancer therapy. So that's, it's partly passion, partly circumstance, and that we have the data. So we go after the data for what we've got.
Right, like a beautiful merger. That's great. So can you tell us more specifically exactly how it is that you go about utilizing AI to analyze the big data, what angles you're looking for, and perhaps also talk about some case studies or success stories that you've had?
Exactly, yeah. So, I think what it comes down to, you said it's like a nice, nice sort of convergence. And I think at Helomics we have a very nice convergence of data that I mentioned. We've gathered from testing live tumors outside the patient body on drugs, on standard of care drugs and normal drugs you might get if you were diagnosed with cancer. We have a massive collection of data that goes along with that drug response, over 150,000 tumors, which is a huge data set. And then again, we have AI, and it's that convergence of AI, the big data, if you will, and the biology. I.e., we're able to test drugs on living tumor tissue rather than some artificial system. Is really what's driving what we do. And I think the other important point about it is that we don't just look at one aspect of the tumor. We look at multiple, as it were, measurements of that tumor, how it responds to drugs, what it looks like, what its mutations in the DNA, how different genes are expressed. So it's what we call a multi-omic approach. It's a bit like, Gregory House, right? You've seen the medical show Gregory House, where he's always ordering up some wacky tests to try and diagnose this patient that's got some, strange disease. And that's a similar sort of thing to that, because cancer is so complex. The human body is so complex. It's not going to be just down to one thing that's driving how the tumor or the patient responds to drugs.
Thank you. So your data set, is it used on a more general scope for cancer in and of itself, or you were also able to put it down to an individual level with a specific patient?
Yeah, so the original the data set, like I said, was acquired from clinical testing, where we would take a live tumor from a patient, from a biopsy, and we specialized in ovarian cancer. We specialize in ovarian cancer, which, as many of you know, is a big killer of women. About 21,000 women get diagnosed with ovarian cancer in the US every year. And we developed and have a validated clinical assay where we take a sample from the patient following surgery to remove their tumor. We grow that tumor in the lab. We test drugs on it. We look at different mutations in the tumor. And then we use that, we compare that with the data that we have in our database, and we feed that back to the oncologist to guide treatment. We don't make a recommendation. We can't prescribe the drug. But this information really helps the clinician to decide what drug, to give that patient. Because in ovarian cancer, we don't have like a BRCA gene that says, oh, if you're positive for this gene, then you should get this drug. We just don't have that kind of level of fidelity at the moment for ovarian. So this drug response profile that we can generate really moves the needle for patients. And in our clinical validation studies, we can show that we can if the clinician chooses the drug that was indicated by this drug response assay, that we can extend the disease-free period for about 2.5 times longer than if they didn't take that recommendation, if you will.
Wow.
So Mark,
that's amazing.
Yeah, that's pretty mind blowing, right?
I was under the
Mark,
impression that it was research based only, but that it's actually treatment based as well is fantastic.
Yeah. So just to point out that the AI is not part of that particular process at the moment. It's our expectation that it will be, because with the AI, what we're doing is we're building predictive models that essentially encapsulate tens of thousands of tumors, how they responded to drugs, what the mutations are in those tumors, demographics about the patient, how old they were, and ethnicity, that sort of thing. And the AI, what the AI is good at is bringing all that data together and building a predictive model that we can ask questions of. And our goal is to build a predictive model. We're on track for it right now. We're doing a study with a local hospital in ovarian cancer, where we expect to be able to produce a predictive model that will predict what drug you should be on and what outcome you'll have. Now, we have to clinically validate that before we can use it to individualize treatment. So it'll be a couple of years before the AI is making those kind of clinical decisions. But because the AI has encapsulated all this knowledge about the tumor, that is gold dust. Trust me, if I'd have had this 20 years ago when I was in pharmaceutical industry, when I cured a lot of mice of cancer I'd given them, this would have been, it's a really big thing. And so pharma companies are becoming very interested in these kind of models that use real world data and can help them discover new therapies in a much more knowledge driven way than they perhaps do at the moment.
So Mark, just to clarify, so currently the models are predominantly being used to analyze massive amounts of data and look at possible treatments, right? So,
yep.
But what you're saying is in the future, because of the learnings from this data set, you could potentially apply it into research, i.e. the ability to permutate thousands of different formulas to potentially find cures. And how far off are we in getting to that point? Because I know in like retail and marketing, some of those machine learning applications are already in play where they could do thousands of permutations to figure out the best approach or best solution. This is obviously not the same thing, right? We're dealing with the human genome, a lot more complex. But curious, how long you think before we get to that place where AI starts to actually replicate, scientists in permutating possible formulations for cures?
Well, we think it's pretty close. We recently actually acquired a Carnegie Mellon University spin-out called Quantitative Medicine. It's some actually people that are now here in Pittsburgh, and that spin-out developed a technology called adaptive learning. So I need to worry about that, but what that can essentially do is screen, test literally billions of possibilities for a drug against, say, ovarian cancer. Ovarian cancer for women, say, that recur, which is a big problem. Do all that in silico, inside a computer, and then instead of spitting out the answer, right, that's a big ask, it recommends what experiments to do. So it's a combination, a round trip between the simulation, if you will, and prediction, using the data that we've acquired to sort of filter, if you will, for want of a better word, filter down to maybe 10 experiments you need to go into the lab and do, rather than doing 1 million experiments or 100,000 experiments. So that's why I say that the AI can really help us discover drugs in the not too distant future. The faster, because we do less experimentation, smarter because we use the machine learning, the adaptive learning, together with our data to decide which experiments to do. And then we do those experiments using the right biology, which is our live tumor testing platform. So you get this whole round trip. And we believe that convergence is really going to move the needle. And certainly pharma companies that we've already talked to, are beginning to see that this kind of union between simulation, AI, big data, and relevant biology is really going to make a difference to our ability to make new medicines. For cancer, because we have a big cancer data set, but potentially you can feed the AI with any data set in principle.
Wow, that's amazing. It sounds as though even a junior scientist could hit the ground running with an adaptive AI assistant like that.
Yeah.
Speaking of practitioners, those folks who are actually building the code for these platforms, where are you finding them? I've heard of scenarios where Google has a whole island, for example, in Singapore. Where are these practitioners? Because that's a fairly complex environment and highly in demand. Where are you guys finding the talent pool for this?
Well, actually, we have an amazing talent pool here in Pittsburgh, and that's part of one of the reasons why I stayed here. I had offers to go all over the world and do this kind of thing, but I stayed here in Pittsburgh. We have Carnegie Mellon University, which is probably one of the most well-known universities for artificial intelligence. Mostly it's, of course, you hear about stories about self-driving cars and drones and Google and all those sorts of things. But what's interesting is, I think, particularly programmers today, they like to know that what they're doing has an impact. And while self-driving cars are kind of cool, and working on those projects is obviously very interesting. Working on a project that might cure cancer that your mom or your grandmother or your wife might have, that is a pretty interesting and attractive proposition, and we tend to get extremely good candidates, coming along with skills in data science, in programming, in biology, in computational biology. And as I said, we have a very good relationship with CMU and with the University of Pittsburgh, because they're one of the top medical research universities in the country as well. So that, again, like I keep saying, that it's that union. You can't just do AI on its own. You have to do AI plus the data. You have to have good data. It has to be comprehensive. It has to be representative of the problem you're trying to solve. And you need good biology. So you need all those three things. And I think being here in Pittsburgh really gives us a talent pool that it'd be hard pressed to find anywhere else. As I said, we don't usually have too much difficulty finding people, because of that sort of personal impact or impact, feeling like they're doing something of worth. Not to say that self-driving cars aren't worthwhile, but curing cancer potentially might have an edge. That's my
right.
That's my
opinion. If you can find a way to formulate a solution for that, you probably can find a way to formulate a solution for a whole lot of other things that are not as complex or lethal, for that matter. I'm curious, though, in terms of the data collection, I've heard that's that's a challenge in terms of even international collaboration. There's a lot of walls that exist. Is that coming down? Perhaps COVID-19 has precipitated more collaboration. What are you seeing in the past 6 months as a result of COVID-19 in terms of sharing more data globally?
I mean, I think certainly the only way to fix a pandemic is you have to fix it everywhere. You fix it nowhere. So that means it's a worldwide, global scientific effort, and I think that certainly we've seen, we've contributed to some research in this space, from our data science perspective, but we've certainly seen huge efforts to share data. The Allen, Brain Institute, made available a whole load of scientific literature that could be used to mine data. Scientists around the world, as they've been sequencing, the genome of the virus and sequencing patients, have been sharing that data. And, we're beginning to see a sort of democratization of the data, which means that more people can consume and really work on that data. And the hope is that sort of global scientific effort, like we had with the Human Genome Project, right? It wasn't just the United States that worked on the Human Genome Project. It was again a global effort. And I think cancer is just as much of a global problem as a pandemic. So there are aspects about data generation where you can do that pre-competitive. You can do that before if you're Pfizer or GSK, you put your sort of secret sauce on it, sort of thing. So I'm hopeful that we do begin to break down those barriers, because again, cancer, heart disease, all these diseases they affect everyone. So it's a global effort, should really, again, that's also going to address the faster, smarter, cheaper, right? Rather than 10 people, 10 researchers racing to find the same thing, 10 researchers could collaborate together to find the one thing more quickly.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds as though when it comes to scientific research, we would be all better served by removing all those barriers and making it a global effort across this. If we track the amount of deaths from cancer as we have tracked COVID-19, it would be probably an ongoing pandemic that hasn't been resolved. That definitely needs to be resolved. And if anyone watching, someone who's been affected by cancer, or you've lost a loved one to it, so it is pervasive. Yeah. Let's talk a little bit about the company culture, if you don't mind. Tell us about what makes it exciting for someone to want to join, Helomics. There's a lot of companies doing this kind of research and this kind of work. What makes you guys interesting to research, or even a developer building these platforms that would make them excited to join?
Yeah, I think we try to create a very inclusive and diverse culture. We have a wide range of experiences and so on, and we offer I guess a kind of environment where we're all focused on the same goal, right? And it doesn't matter whether you're coding some basic script to analyze some genomic data, or you're in the lab, growing the tumors, testing the tumors, doing that sort of stuff. Everybody is really focused on that mission because they know what an impact it makes. We know what impact our clinical tests make. So, those people, whenever a clinical sample comes in, it's all hands on deck. We're ready to test it and turn it around and get the result back. And in the research work, again, we all realize that this has the potential to make a big impact. And I think the culture that we have is is embraces that, and we do as much as we can to cope with flexible. I mean, we've been open. Our lab is an essential lab, so we've been open all the way through the pandemic. The combination of split shifts and virtual working and trying to accommodate people's different schedules with family and kids and so on. So I think it's just really respecting individuals, trying to create a work environment where they can excel. I mean, a very smart guy said to me, with my uncle, said to me, hire smart people and get out their way. And I think that's been my management and leadership philosophy, ever since I left the lab and went into the business world. So I think people like to come and work because we make it a fun atmosphere. We're all focused on a single goal, and that goal is pretty interesting. It's not to say it's not challenging, or people don't work really, really hard, but I think that's the kind of culture we try to create.
Cool. Thanks for sharing. We're coming up on time. I think there was another question or a question from the audience. Carlos, you're on mute.
Yeah, the question was mine, Tulio. Thank you.
We don't need AI to predict that Carlos will be on mute when he comes up.
Absolutely not. You need someone to run this thing, right? Okay.
I was actually going to say that when we were doing our pre-show talk, and like, yeah, we have the cat on the side, and I'm like, yeah, guaranteed to say, Carlos, you're on mute.
It's just too easy. I don't even type it on the private chat. So it's like, it's just fun to watch every time.
We're well past that now.
Consistently. We love you, Carlos.
Okay, well, you're the one who said we were coming up on time, so I need to get into this. Okay. Yeah. So well, it's more a comment than a question, Mark. And I think I mentioned to you that a few months ago, back in March, we had a conversation of a similar nature, and in that conversation, we touched on what was then called the limits. So, what are the limits to AI in approaching such a complex matter like cancer, of course? So my question or my comment would be along those lines. So from your perspective, what are the limits to this? Because there might be people out there that, of course, I'm not going to say that technology can help us to solve many problems and maybe predict future ones, but what are the reasonable limits or the boundaries so that people don't overextend their expectations or even their hope? So how can they be well balanced to be realistic in terms of what lies ahead? Is there any way you can elaborate on that?
I mean, I think the limits are really to do with data, right? I mean, I think the AI systems we have now are very sophisticated, and we can buy them by the hour at Amazon. So it's not necessarily a limitation of the AI algorithms per se, though algorithm development proceeds. But it's really a limitation of the data and the sort of questions we want to ask and what we want the AI system to do. I think I've always believed that computers should augment what humans do, not replace what humans do. And I think that's often, forgotten. We're not looking to replace armies of scientists or doctors or nurses or oncologists. We're looking to use AI to help them. I think if you bound that the hype and the hope, if you will, based upon that, then that leads you. That should get us to a balanced place where we're balancing the hype and the hope by picking off reasonably straightforward questions, learning from those, seeing how those get used, how they get acted upon, and then using that to sort of over time, continually, improve what the AI system does, but never trying to replace always trying to augment, because that's what we as humans do, right? We use tools. We would have lasted no time at all, because we're not really very fast, we're not really very strong, but we can use tools and we can work together. And I think that, for me, is the limit, or how you should think about limits for AI.
Thanks, Mark. I think it's a very prudent advice for people to separate the Hollywood fantasy of AI and accept that it's not here to replace us. It's here to help us and augment the things we already do and make us faster at doing them, and hopefully smarter at doing them too. So thanks for joining us today. It's been a pleasure to have you just stay with us as we wrap up. Monday, we've got the recap show coming at 1 p.m. We're going to recap 3 shows from this week. If anyone who's watching wants to participate on the recap show, just make a comment right in the, wherever you're watching us, make a comment, say, I'd like to participate, and we will invite you to be one of the Brady Bunch squares right here on the Dojo Live. And speaking of next week, what do we got coming up next week besides the recap show on Monday?
Sure, Tulio, thank you. Well, we have 3 companies, 3 guests, and I don't have the topics yet. I'm chasing them, but we're going to have Elucidate, and we're also going to have, we're going to have Sandoso, which is a marketing automation tool, a great marketing automation tool. And also we're going to be speaking with one of the principals, Max Phillips, one of the principals at, Launch Squad. Now, again, in this occasion, I don't have the details, but as ever, it should be interesting as all of the Dojo Live interviews and conversations we had. And they're all going to be at 1 p.m. Pacific, they're all going to be at 1 p.m. Pacific right here on Dojo Live, Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday. So I encourage you folks to stay tuned and for the topics, and that are going to be shared soon on the Dojo Live website. So that's what we have, Tulio.
Thanks for joining in, everyone, and stay safe.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.
Thank you.